Hello there, and welcome to Hominid History Hub, a place where curiosity gets comfortable and science takes the scenic path towards sleep. Tonight, we're drifting back far beyond written memory, past the first word carved into stone or the first melody hummed around a fire. We're traveling into an age so ancient it sits on the hazy line between myth and memory, a time when the earliest humans looked up at the night sky and wondered not just what the stars were, but who might have placed them there. It might sound whimsical at first, but tonight we're going to explore that idea gently. What if humanity didn't start entirely on its own? What if, long before Egypt, long before Sumer, long before any empire we can name, there existed a civilization so old that its teachings became the foundation for everything that came after, a civilization that, in some quiet, forgotten way, shaped the earliest minds? Before we unfold that thought, take a breath and notice where you are. Maybe you're lying in bed with the lights low and your phone glowing softly. Maybe the world around you has already settled down for the night, or maybe a city is still humming outside your window. Wherever you are, you're part of a chain of moments stretching back tens of thousands of years. Every thought you think, every word you know, every tool you touch belongs to a story that didn't begin with you or me, but with the first people who stared into the unknown and chose to understand it. So, where are you listening from tonight? A small apartment, a far-off time zone, a place with stars or streetlights outside your window? In this quiet moment, imagine you're joining a long line of listeners reaching all the way back to those ancient firesides, where stories were the first science and memory was the only library. If this slow journey into our oldest mysteries feels soothing or intriguing, like wandering through ancient ruins with only your thoughts to guide you, I'd appreciate a like or a subscription. It helps this calm corner of curiosity find others who might also want a peaceful place to drift before sleep. Now, let's take our first step into the deep past, not quickly, but slowly, as if crossing a dusty threshold where even the air seems to remember. Picture yourself standing at the edge of an ancient world, long before civilization meant cities, kings, or calendars. The air smells of earth and smoke, bones scatter the ground, and somewhere nearby, the first sparks of human consciousness are just beginning to glow. Our ancestors, early Homo sapiens, already knew how to hunt, shape tools, and gather around fire. But something inside them was changing. The drawings began, hands on cave walls, animal silhouettes, mysterious dots and patterns. Some believe they weren't merely art, but language, or even instruction. These markings were the first whispers, the faintest record of an idea too complex to disappear completely with time. Something, or someone, had begun to teach. It's easy to imagine early humans as scattered tribes learning everything through slow trial and error. But what if some knowledge came faster than expected? Farming appeared in several regions of the world at nearly the same moment. Massive monuments, from Britain's stone circles to Turkey's temple mounds, rose suddenly, with no obvious developmental steps leading up to them. And across cultures, from African deserts to Polynesian islands, we find stories of cosmic teachers, beings from the sky, wise ancestors from the sea, gods who walked the earth and taught humans how to build, how to count, how to speak. Are these shared stories just coincidences, or echoes of a civilization so ancient it survives only as myth? If you trace the roots of knowledge, the kind that measures stars, designs cities, or builds calendars, you often find it appearing fully formed in the archaeological record. The Sumerians, for example, seem to emerge out of nowhere more than 6,000 years ago, with writing, advanced math, and irrigation already established. The Egyptians, with their precise astronomy, hieroglyphs, and monumental architecture, also rise without a clear evolutionary ladder beneath them. Archaeologists explain these leaps as the result of long but undocumented development, and that may be true. But what if those missing steps aren't missing at all? What if they're simply buried, not just under soil, but under forgotten eras when the teachers still walked among us? There's a term that occasionally appears in discussions like this: the first civilization, not Atlantis in its legendary ocean-swallowed form, but something real, tangible and lost. A society may have existed long before the last ice age ended, at a time when sea levels were far lower, and vast regions now underwater were home to thriving communities. Around 12,000 years ago, the planet warmed, the ice sheets melted, and the oceans rose more than 100 meters, swallowing coastlines and possibly entire cultures. If such a civilization ever existed, coastal, skilled, and seafaring, it would have vanished almost completely beneath the waves, leaving behind only scattered traces like the submerged ruins off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean. But why would this matter? Because knowledge doesn't simply disappear. It travels. It survives through stories, rituals, and habits so ancient that we no longer think to ask where they came from. The alignments of early temples with solstices, the counting systems woven into myths, the shared memories of floods and teachers and builders, all of these could be remnants of that first great transfer of knowledge. If an earlier civilization truly taught early humans the foundations of everything, its lessons wouldn't have been written in books. They would have been written into our behavior, our instincts, even our curiosity. Teaching is one of humanity's most natural acts. We do it without effort. Parents teach their children, elders guide the young, and knowledge gets refined and passed on across generations. Now imagine that this instinct wasn't entirely ours, that it was inherited. Imagine the first humans learning how to shape clay into bricks, how to follow the stars to track the seasons, how to carve stones that would stand for thousands of years. And imagine those teachers standing quietly in the background as their students spread out, changed, and eventually forgot who first showed them the way. There's something haunting and comforting in the idea that all of civilization might be an echo of a lesson too old to name. Archaeologists often describe civilization as something that ignited spontaneously in different regions of the world. But maybe it wasn't a spark. Maybe it was a hand passed from one generation to the next, an inheritance that began in a single forgotten place and traveled through migration, storytelling, and imitation. Take the ruins at Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. They're at least 11,000 years old, built by hunter-gatherers long before agriculture supposedly existed. The carvings are detailed, symbolic, intentional. They show a level of organization and shared knowledge that doesn't fit the usual timeline. It feels as if someone already understood how to build, align, and preserve meaning. If you could walk among those ancient builders, you'd find people who didn't yet know the word civilization, but carried the seed of it in their minds. They didn't have kings or coins, but they had geometry, astronomy, and ritual. Where did those come from? Some say slow evolution, others say instruction, lessons remembered dimly, preserved through symbols, and passed along until the symbols themselves became sacred. Circles, crosses, spirals, shapes that appear in nearly every ancient culture long before they ever met each other. It's almost like they were inherited, the alphabet of a forgotten language we no longer know how to read. Think about that. How much of what you know today came from someone else? The way you tie a knot, hold a spoon, read a sentence, or check the time. None of it was discovered alone. We live inside an invisible inheritance, so it might not be so strange to imagine that the first humans inherited more than survival skills. Maybe they inherited wisdom, a kind of prehistoric mentorship that nudged them toward everything that came next. Over thousands of years, the original meaning of those lessons would have faded. The teachers became gods, the instructions became myths, and the knowledge turned into instinct. But somewhere in that ancient exchange, humanity's curiosity took shape. Every civilization tells stories about its beginnings, often about gods or wise ancestors who descended from the sky or rose from the sea to teach. The Dogon people of Mali speak of beings from Sirius who shared astronomical knowledge long before telescopes existed. The Sumerians told of the Anunnaki, who taught them agriculture, architecture, and law. In South America, the Inca remembered Viracocha, a tall bearded figure who came from the sea after a great flood and taught them how to rebuild across the Pacific. Polynesian traditions speak of navigators from the stars. The pattern is strikingly similar. Teachers appear, civilization begins, and the teachers disappear. Whether you take these as metaphors or memories, the message remains the same. Knowledge was given. Of course, science demands evidence, and it should. Stories alone cannot prove a forgotten civilization. When we look at the archaeological record, we find anomalies that don't fit neatly into our timelines. Tools and carvings appear in layers far older than they should be. Early Renaissance-era maps show coastlines no one should have known before modern exploration. Megalithic structures display engineering precision we still argue about today. None of these discoveries prove the existence of ancient teachers on their own, but together they create the feeling that humanity was rediscovering something, climbing back toward knowledge that once existed. If there's any truth to this idea, then the first civilization wasn't defined by cities or conquest, but by curiosity, by the desire to understand the world and pass that understanding forward. Maybe they watched the stars not to worship them, but to measure them. Maybe they built monuments not as tombs, but as textbooks carved into stone. And maybe their greatest accomplishment wasn't a structure or an invention, but the act of teaching itself, lighting a spark of curiosity that still burns in us today. When we study ancient ruins, we often do it with a quiet kind of arrogance, assuming progress is linear and our ancestors were primitive compared to us. But what if intelligence isn't measured by technology, but by understanding? What if those early builders knew things we've only recently rediscovered? Not through magic, but through careful observation over vast stretches of time, watching tides, tracking stars, noting seasons, reading stone. Maybe they understood the earth like a book we're only now beginning to decode again. It's strange to think that each of us is shaped by memory, not just our own, but the memory of countless generations. The shape of a tool, the rhythm of language, the instinct to look up at the stars, all of it inherited. So when we talk about a first civilization that taught early humans everything, maybe we're not imagining an empire at all. Maybe we're talking about the moment when memory became more powerful than instinct, when knowledge started living longer than the people who discovered it. If you listen closely, you can almost picture those first teachers, not as mysterious strangers, but as reflections of us at our most curious. They may not have built machines or written equations, but they understood the power of sharing what they knew. And maybe that's what makes us their descendants. We still gather to learn. We still tell stories to those who come after, and we still look at the world and ask, how does it work? Why are we here? What came before us? As the night deepens and sleep begins to pull gently at your mind, hold on to the thought that you're part of an unbroken chain of learning, stretching all the way back to the very first spark of thought. Perhaps that first civilization didn't disappear at all. Perhaps it became us. It's easy to forget that for most of human history, we had no cities, no calendars, no clocks. The story of our species is mostly a quiet one, written not in monuments but in footprints and the ashes of fires long gone. Before any empire rose or any historian took notes, there were simply people, families, wanderers, hunters, dreamers. They lived by the rise and fall of light, the hunger of seasons, the rustle of animals in the distance, and the silent pattern of stars overhead. And somehow from those simple, fragile lives, the foundation of everything we now call civilization began to take shape. If you could step into that ancient world, you wouldn't find towering temples or stone cities. You'd find a landscape constantly shifting, herds moving across plains, rivers carving new paths, smoke drifting from a small morning fire. Around that fire, a few figures gather. Their voices are soft, their gestures simple, but they understand one another. They point to the sky, to the fire, to each other. What's happening between them is more than instinct. It's the first trace of deliberate teaching. Language is being born. It won't be written down for tens of thousands of years, but it's already taking shape in the space between breaths. What those early humans couldn't have known is that this small act, one mind reaching toward another to share a thought, would become the heart of civilization. Teaching didn't begin in temples or schools. It began by the fire, in the simple act of showing someone how to strike a spark, how to shape a stone, how to recognize which berries were safe. From those moments of shared survival grew something extraordinary: culture. Every word, every gesture, every lesson stored in memory instead of on a page. Civilization didn't begin as a place. It began as a pattern of remembering. When archaeologists study the earliest human sites, they often uncover tools that seem too refined for their era. Perfectly shaped blades, beads made from shells carried hundreds of miles inland, ochre used for painting long before the idea of art existed. These clues show that these people weren't simply surviving. They were imagining, planning, creating mental maps of their world. And where there are maps, there are stories. It's one thing to exist in the world, and another to describe it. The moment someone could explain it, even in a gesture or a sound, something new began. The ability to imagine what wasn't there. That's the real dawn of civilization, not the first city, but the first idea that outlived the person who thought it. The first story passed through generations. The first remembered instruction that made someone else's life easier. It might have been something simple like, follow the herds when the moon is full, or these roots ease pain. But from those early sentences came calendars, medicine, and navigation. Before the pyramids or temples, there was memory, and memory alone was enough to change everything. It's astonishing that for about 95% of human history, we lived without writing. All the books and libraries and inventions we treasure today occupy just a tiny fraction of our timeline. The rest is a vast, silent expanse of unrecorded experience. Humanity learning, forgetting, and learning again. But that silence wasn't empty. It was filled with laughter, song, and stories whispered under the stars. Stories that might sound like myths to us now, but to the people who told them, they were survival guides, teaching which plants bloom with the rains, which stars signal changing seasons, where shelter waits and where danger sleeps. Somewhere in that long, dim past, groups began to grow. As the ice retreated and the world warmed, food became easier to find, and people stayed in one place long enough to notice patterns. They watched shadows shift through the year, rivers swell and shrink, animals migrate. Slowly the rhythm of nature became the rhythm of thought. Time wasn't just passing, it could be measured, predicted, even shaped. The first calendars weren't carved into stone, they were constellations, remembered by storytellers, recited to children, and passed down like sacred truth. Civilization began not with kings, but with those who remembered. These early communities wouldn't look like civilization in any formal sense. There were no laws carved into tablets, no temples of stone, but there were shared customs, roles, and rituals. There was the hunter who knew the herd's paths, the gatherer who recognized the scent of safe plants, the elder who remembered which cave flooded, and the storyteller who could weave fear into something manageable at night. Each person held part of something greater than themselves. Knowledge wasn't owned, it was lived. And when someone died, their memory was passed on to someone else. That was civilization before writing, a living library that breathed and aged with the people who carried it. You can almost feel what that world was like, sitting by the fire, listening to someone explain the stars, realizing those same patterns will return next year. The comfort in knowing that what happened before will happen again, and that you can prepare for it. That was the moment the future was invented, the shift from reacting to predicting, from surviving to planning. It must have felt magical. The realization that the world had a rhythm and people could learn to move with it. When archaeologists uncovered places like Blombos Cave in South Africa, with carved pieces of ochre dating back over 70,000 years, they realized symbolic thinking appeared far earlier than we thought. Those markings weren't random. They were intentional, symmetrical, possibly part of a code or ritual. They show that even then, humans weren't just reacting to the world, they were representing it. And representation is the root of culture. Once you can symbolize something, you can teach it. Once you can teach it, you can improve it. Knowledge compounds like interest. Over time, small groups grew into larger ones. Villages formed. People began to share not only food, but beliefs, ideas, hopes. The first artists painted animals they'd never hunted, scenes they might never have seen. Maybe those paintings were stories, or prayers, or experiments in imagination. Whatever they were, they prove humans had begun creating worlds within their minds, imagining what didn't exist and giving it form that is the seed of invention, architecture, and myth. All the tools of civilization grow from that single root, imagination made real. But there's something else at the core. Cooperation. Civilization requires it. You can't build even a small shelter alone or plant a field without help. Before we learned to shape stone, we learned to work together. That meant trusting, communicating, remembering who did what. In a way, the first governments weren't kings or councils. They were communities bound by shared responsibility. The tribe that remembered the herd's paths survived longer than the one that forgot. The group that shared knowledge lasted longer than the one that hid it. Slowly, the act of sharing became sacred. Teaching became ritual. Memory became inheritance. And there's another pattern visible in archaeological layers. Wherever humans stayed for long stretches, we find signs of ceremony, graves with offerings, carvings of ancestors or spirits. That means memory wasn't just practical, it became emotional, even spiritual. People began honoring those who came before, cherishing their lessons. And in doing so, they built continuity, a thread connecting the living to the dead, the present to the past, and generations to one another. The living and the dead once belonged to the same unfolding story, part of a long chain of memory stretching back into the unknown. That early sense of reverence eventually evolved into religion, but before it became doctrine, it was simply gratitude. Gratitude for those who taught, who remembered, who kept life moving forward. It's possible that this deep respect for memory inspired the earliest legends of divine teachers, not because gods descended from the sky, but because early humans saw knowledge itself as sacred. Picture someone in a small wandering group who could explain why the moon changed shape, or who could read the sky and sense when rain was coming. To everyone else, that person would seem almost otherworldly, a guardian of secrets, a link between what was known and what was mysterious. Over time, as those stories were shared again and again, the line between a wise human and a god blurred. Maybe that's where ideas about the first great teachers, the first civilization, truly began. In awe of the human mind, learning to understand its world. You can imagine the moment someone carved a symbol, not just for decoration, but for meaning. A circle for the sun, a row of marks to count passing days. Those small carvings were memory made visible. For the first time, knowledge didn't need to survive only through voice or recollection. It could be preserved outside the human mind, a step toward writing, a step toward permanence. Civilization began leaving traces deeper than bone. Looking back, it's easy to assume this transformation was inevitable, but nothing about it was guaranteed. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived without farming, without cities, without written language. And then, suddenly in geological terms, everything shifted. People settled, planted, built. Something tipped the scale. Maybe it was the changing climate, maybe expanding populations, or maybe it was the slow accumulation of all those quiet lessons whispered across generations, finally reaching a point where the world simply had to change. What's striking is that even the earliest civilizations seem to appear with knowledge already in hand. They understood geometry, tracked stars, practiced early medicine. There's little sign of trial and error at the beginning. It's as if certain ideas had been preserved orally for millennia before they were ever carved into stone. Maybe the first civilization wasn't a single city or culture, but a period, a wider awakening shared across migrating groups, a rising consciousness handed down from one generation to the next. Every generation adds its layer to the story. Maybe the people before us added theirs through rhythm, song, or symbols instead of ink. The result is the same. We inherit a world shaped by those who came before, expand it, and pass it on. Long before borders or kingdoms existed, civilization was like a melody, passed from voice to voice, changing over time but never stopping. You can still hear faint traces of it in ancient myths, in rituals whose meanings we've forgotten, but whose motions we still perform, lighting candles, watching the sky, noting the return of seasons. These are echoes of an ancient rhythm older than recorded time. Imagine what it felt like to live then, in a world without written history, where every discovery felt brand new, every day was a lesson, a world where you looked at the horizon without knowing the word for distance, saw lightning without the concept of electricity, witnessed birth and death without the language to separate them as ideas. That world wasn't primitive, it was untouched, thought in its earliest form, trying to understand itself. Civilization didn't truly begin when people built walls. It began when they started asking questions, and even after thousands of years, we're still asking the same ones. Where did we come from? Who taught us? How did we become who we are? The answers might lie buried beneath oceans or under ancient ice, or maybe they're hidden in our own nature, our instinct to teach, to share, to preserve. Before civilization had a name, it was already alive within us, waiting to be remembered. The night is long, but history stretches even farther. As the mind drifts across these ideas, the distance between past and present softens. The people who painted caves, who welcomed the first sunrise of a new season, who gazed at the stars and wondered, they're not gone. They remain in every idea, every question, every moment of recognition that lights the mind. In that continuity, we're still sitting beside the fire, still learning, still holding on to the lessons the first teachers tried to pass down. And as the flames fade to warm embers, the story moves toward those who may have sparked the first lights of knowledge, those we now call the forgotten architects of wisdom. It's strange how silence can hold so much memory. We think remembering requires words or records, but sometimes the past endures in shapes, in alignments, in the precise, quiet geometry of structures built to outlast names. Those forgotten architects didn't leave journals or manifestos. They left stone. They left order. They left mysteries that make even the most skeptical among us stop and wonder how, by the time civilizations appear in the historical record, with writing, rulers, and laws, they already look like the continuation of something older. The Sumerians calculated the heavens using math so refined that traces of it remain in our modern systems of time. The Egyptians aligned temples and pyramids with such astronomical accuracy that even today's instruments struggle to improve on their precision. The creators of Stonehenge tracked solstices and eclipses with massive circles of rock whose purpose and method still puzzle us. These achievements don't appear as slow developments. They feel like the flowering of knowledge already understood, as if someone had laid the groundwork far earlier. Imagine standing at sites like Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, the pyramids, or Machu Picchu. Touch the stones, shaped thousands of years ago by hands that worked with tools we assume were too simple to achieve such perfection. The blocks at Baalbek weigh hundreds of tons. The seamless joints of Sacsayhuaman in Peru fit together so tightly you couldn't slide a paper between them. These aren't merely feats of muscle, they're feats of understanding, geometry, leverage, logistics, memory. We call these builders ancient, but maybe ancient isn't quite right. Maybe they inherited knowledge far older than they were, wisdom carried through disaster and forgetting. When the last ice age ended, seas rose over 100 meters. Entire regions disappeared beneath the water. Sunderland near Indonesia, Doggerland between Britain and Europe, long stretches of coastlines worldwide. If people lived there, if they built or traded or mapped the sky, their cities are now silent seafloors, their stories buried in sand. And yet fragments remain. Off India's coast, divers have found submerged structures that resemble walls and streets. In Japan's Yonaguni, step terraces beneath the water look as though they were carved on purpose. No one agrees on what they were, natural formations or lost architecture, but the mind can't help imagining the implications if they weren't accidents. If a civilization existed before recorded history, it would have been nearly erased by rising seas. Only the highest or most sacred structures might have survived, becoming the seeds from which later cultures grew. Survivors might have carried their knowledge inward, star charts, planting techniques, principles of measurement, sharing them with new communities. Over time, the origins of that knowledge would blur, the teachers would become gods, their homes transformed into heavens, their boats into chariots of divine light. This isn't a bedtime fantasy, though it carries a dreamlike wonder. Even established archaeologists and geologists occasionally find signs of human activity far older than expected. A shaped tool, a fire pit, pottery and sediment that shouldn't contain it. Each discovery triggers debate. Was it contamination, coincidence, or a clue to a much larger story? Step back, and the timeline of human progress begins to look like a mosaic. Pieces missing, colors faded, edges that don't align perfectly, but clearly belong to the same image. And across continents, the oldest known monuments share the same themes. They're enormous, meticulously aligned to celestial patterns, built not just to endure but to teach. At Göbekli Tepe, the pillars are arranged with deliberate astronomical meaning. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid aligns almost flawlessly with the cardinal directions at Chichen Itza. The shadow of a serpent slides down the steps only on the equinoxes. These are not accidents. These are lessons written into architecture, cosmic textbooks carved in stone. Who were the teachers that built on such a colossal scale? Maybe not individuals, but whole cultures dedicated to understanding rather than mere survival. We often imagine ancient humans as focused entirely on food and safety, yet again and again they poured unimaginable effort into studying the sky, marking cycles, aligning structures. These weren't hobbies, they were acts of remembrance. To watch the heavens is to track time, predict seasons, understand change. Building that understanding into stone is a message to the future. We knew this once, don't forget. There's something humbling about that. New knowledge feels like discovery, but knowledge that reappears after thousands of years feels like memory. The forgotten architects of wisdom may not have been gods or extraterrestrials. They may have been human beings just like us, minds as sharp, curiosity as fierce, hands as steady. They didn't need advanced machines, just patience, intelligence, and mastery of principles we're still trying to rediscover. Take Puma Punku in Bolivia. Stones carved with precise grooves and perfect angles, some with drilled holes that seem impossible using simple copper tools. And yet they did it. Theories range from lost methods to the remnants of an older engineering tradition. Maybe it was both. It's easy to romanticize these mysteries, to imagine magic or vanished technology, but the truth might be even more extraordinary, because it is human. A legacy of memory, skill, and curiosity older than history itself. What if those forgotten builders weren't magicians or gods at all, but teachers? Teachers who understood that the greatest gift isn't invention, it's the ability to pass knowledge forward, to shape an idea so clearly that it survives long after the hands that created it are gone, to build something so intentional, so durable, that it keeps teaching even when every trace of the original voice has faded. Maybe every temple, every stone ring, every ancient alignment was really a classroom in plain sight, an open-air library built not for deities, but for students who wouldn't be born for thousands of years. And everywhere we look, later cultures seem to echo that same instinct to build in order to teach the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the step pyramids of Mesoamerica, the great mounds of North America, the dolmens scattered across Europe, all of them share a single impulse: to mark, to preserve, to pass on. They remind us that civilization isn't defined by comfort, but by continuity, a long chain of understanding stretching back into the dimmest reaches of time, and at the very beginning of that chain stand people whose names we no longer know. The clues they left behind aren't always massive or dramatic. Sometimes they're hidden in numbers instead of monuments. Across ancient sites worldwide, the same ratios appear again and again: geometric constants, repeating angles, recurring proportions. The golden ratio: circles defined by pi, patterns in sacred geometry that emerge like a universal memory. We think of math as something humanity invented, but maybe it was something rediscovered, something our ancestors once perceived with an ease we've forgotten. They may not have needed written equations. They might have seen those same proportions in seashells, in spiraling plants, in the curve of the horizon, and recognized in them a rhythm woven into the world itself. When they built in tune with that rhythm, and that is why their works endure. These forgotten architects shaped more than stone. They shaped perception. By carving ideas into the physical world, they made knowledge something you could walk inside, feel, experience. When you stand before an ancient structure and feel that strange calm, that sense of balance almost like music, you're feeling the echo of their minds. Their language of harmony still speaks. Even after thousands of years, stone endures longer than words. But even stone changes. Earthquakes tilt it, winds soften it, rain slowly wears it down. What survives is incomplete, mysterious. So we look at the fragments and try to rebuild the story. Every generation forms its own interpretation, layering new imagination over ancient intention. Sometimes we get close, sometimes we only see our own reflections, but the connection remains, and the lessons continue. Maybe those early builders never cared about being remembered individually. Maybe their goal was continuity, to make sure that when floods came, when empires collapsed, when languages disappeared, the core of human understanding would still be preserved. How to track the year, how to align with the heavens, how to find balance, both physically and spiritually. Their monuments might have been survival manuals disguised as sanctuaries, and if that was their purpose, then they succeeded. Because here we are, thousands of years later, still reading their work, still puzzling over their messages, still asking the same questions they once asked. Where do we come from? How does the world work? What happens when knowledge disappears? Those questions are the roots of science, philosophy, and belief itself. These early teachers didn't just leave behind structures, they left behind a way of thinking. When we see ancient ruins today, it's easy to feel a disbelief that borders on awe. How could people so long ago create such precision, such beauty, such foresight? But maybe that disbelief reveals more about us than about them. We measure intelligence by technology. They measured it by understanding. Without machines, they relied on observation. Without libraries, they relied on memory. Across continents, the earliest builders raised vast stones into circles, passageways, pyramids, and mounds. Each seems alive with intention. Some mark the sun's path, some the moon's, others the positions of stars that have long since drifted from their ancient homes. It's as if the whole world once studied from the same celestial textbook. Whether in Egypt, Britain, China, or Mesoamerica, the sky was their instructor and stone was their notebook. At first glance, these alignments feel too precise to be chance. The Great Pyramid's sides almost perfectly match the cardinal directions. Stonehenge frames the midsummer sunrise. Angkor's temples mirror the constellation. Draco Teotihuacan's pyramids line up with Orion's belt. Civilizations separated by oceans and thousands of years, all engaged in the same silent dialogue between earth and the heavens. We, surrounded by screens and city lights, often ask, why? Why move unimaginable weights of stone just to mark a sunrise? Why carve star maps into rock walls? Why build observatories out of megaliths? But to them, the sky wasn't decoration. It was instruction, memory, calendar, compass, and maybe a reminder of the first teachers who showed humanity where to look. Imagine a world without electric glare, where the night sky wasn't something faint and distant, but overwhelming, bright, endless, deeply alive. To study the sky was to discover structure in what first looked like chaos, the slow sweep of the planets, the dependable return of certain constellations, the rare bright flare of a comet. All of it would have felt like messages woven into the universe. But what if, for some early people, these weren't just rhythms to admire? What if they were reminders of an older lesson, a way of marking time and place that once connected the heavens and the earth in a single, continuous design? Knowledge often hides inside ritual. The people who built Stonehenge didn't simply raise stones, they gathered there to watch, to track moments, to remember. Maybe it was celebration, maybe worship. But beneath every ceremony was a scientific core. They had calculated the tilt of the earth, the sun's yearly movement, the turning of the seasons. In those patterns was survival, when to plant, when to harvest, when animals would migrate, and maybe, buried even deeper, was a sense of loyalty to a tradition older than their own language, a tradition taught by the first people who looked at the stars with purpose. In Egypt's deserts, that same instinct became monumental. The builders of the pyramids aimed them not only to the compass points, but to the stars themselves. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid align with the ancient positions of Orion and Sirius, stars loaded with symbolic and mythic weight. Egyptians believed their gods came from those constellations, but maybe the idea began more humbly, as a way to align their calendar to celestial cycles. Over generations, as memory blurred, the teachers in the sky became gods, and the instructions became devotion. Knowledge turns into myth easily when enough time passes. The facts remain, the meaning drifts. The same pattern appears far from the Nile. In Mesoamerica, the Maya built cities that doubled as enormous observatories. At Chichen Itza, the pyramid casts a serpent-like shadow during the equinox, a perfect interplay of sunlight and architecture that required advanced astronomical understanding. To achieve it, they had to know the sun's movement, the earth's tilt, and the shape of the horizon. Earlier still, the builders of Teotihuacan aligned their city's main avenue with the setting of the Pleiades, a star cluster tied to agricultural timing. Again and again, scientific knowledge wrapped itself in story, and ritual carried astronomy forward. Across the world, the pattern repeats. At Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, a stone circle older than Stonehenge marks the rising of the summer solstice sun. In Machu Picchu, windows are precisely aligned with solstices, while the Intihuatana stone, the hitching post of the sun, casts no shadow at midday during the equinox, a sign the Incas were tracking solar zeniths with impressive accuracy. In northern Europe, at Newgrange in Ireland, the winter solstice sunrise pierces deep into the inner chamber, illuminating spirals carved thousands of years ago that may represent cosmic cycles. How did so many cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, build similar monuments for similar purposes? Coincidence is possible, but the repetition feels almost too coordinated. Some researchers believe knowledge traveled, that long before recorded history, seafarers or wandering teachers carried ideas across continents, leaving behind not just tools or languages, but a shared understanding of the sky. Others argue that any intelligent people studying the same heavens would naturally reach similar conclusions. Maybe both ideas are true. Still, it's hard not to sense a faint whisper of instruction running through all this work. These stones don't only record time, they carry emotion. Lifting them, shaping them, aligning them, wasn't just observation, it was belonging. To look at the sky and see meaning is to feel connected to something larger, something ordered. The builders may have believed they weren't just mapping the stars, they were recreating them on Earth, turning the land itself into a reflection of the sky. Temples became mirrors, cities became constellations. The old phrase, as above, so below, written thousands of years later, might have begun as an intuitive truth shared by the first astronomers. The same order shapes both heaven and earth. This idea appears in places that never met. Ancient Chinese capitals were designed around the position of the pole star. Egyptians placed their pyramids to reflect Orion's belt. The Inca aligned sacred sites with the winter path of the Milky Way. The mound builders of North America shaped earthworks to track lunar cycles and solstices. Wherever humanity woke into awareness, it seems the instinct was the same. Write the sky onto the earth, turn knowledge into something visible and permanent. It's worth remembering the patience this required. Without telescopes, clocks, or metal instruments, they watched and measured with nothing but their eyes and persistence. A full lunar cycle takes almost 19 years to repeat. Some celestial patterns, like those of Venus or the precession of the equinoxes, take lifetimes or even centuries. Someone had to begin measurements, knowing they'd never see them completed, trusting the next generation to continue the work. That isn't just science, it's faith, not in gods, but in learning and continuity. Maybe that's the deeper meaning of these echoes in stone and sky. They aren't messages from another planet, they're messages from another time. They say, keep watching, keep measuring, keep passing this forward. Each alignment is a conversation across ages between the builders and anyone who would someday rediscover their intentions. When modern astronomers calculate the exact dates these monuments track, when satellites confirm their precision, we're answering questions that were asked thousands of years ago. Sometimes the echoes are literal. The acoustics of ancient sites often seem deliberately engineered. In the temples of Chavin in Peru, sound moves through corridors in ways that amplify and transform it. At the Great Ball Court in Chichen Itza, a single clap produces multiple echoes that resemble bird calls. Digital reconstructions of Stonehenge show resonance patterns that could carry voices across long distances. To the builders, sound, like light, was a connection between earth and sky, vibration as language, resonance as memory. It's no wonder later generations saw these places as divine. When sunlight strikes a chamber at the exact moment of a solstice, or stars line up perfectly with carved markers, it feels like the universe is speaking. Today we call it astronomy, engineering, geometry, but the human heart still calls it wonder. And maybe that's exactly what the first teachers hoped we would feel, not obedience but awe, a curiosity deep enough to keep us looking upward forever. Over time, as languages shifted and civilizations rose and fell, the original reasons for these structures faded. The builders' names disappeared. Their measurements became myths, their symbols became sacred stories. A solar calendar turned into a tale of a sun god. An astronomical chart became a legend of serpents and dragons in the sky. Knowledge didn't vanish. It simply changed shape. That's how it survives. The stones are not relics, they're participants in an ongoing dialogue. Every time someone stops and wonders at them, they fulfill their purpose again. The echo moves forward. That's the magic of ancient knowledge. It doesn't require belief, only attention. You don't have to worship it. You just have to notice it. And sometimes the sky answers back. The stars those ancient builders tracked have shifted over millennia as Earth's axis slowly wobbles. By comparing their alignments to today's night sky, we can calculate exactly when those monuments were built. It's as if the sky itself keeps their memory, storing timestamps in starlight. The teachers may be forgotten, but their calendar still runs above us. Maybe that's the real legacy of the first civilization. Not wealth or inventions, but the habit of watching, the art of noticing. The same curiosity that drove them to carve stones and measure shadows now drives us to build telescopes and send probes into the cosmos. We still use the sky to orient ourselves. The only difference is that the stars we measure now are galaxies away instead of seasons apart. If the first teachers could see what we've built, satellites tracing orbits, telescopes capturing the birth of galaxies, they might recognize it instantly, not because we surpassed them, but because we continued their work. Their stones were our first observatories. Their stories became our equations. Their echo has reached us, and in answering it, we send our own into the future. Every generation stands under the same sky, sees the same constellations, feels the same tug toward understanding. Patterns shift, but the desire to read them remains constant. Maybe that's why the stones were raised, to remind us that knowledge isn't something you own, it's a path you walk. The stars rise and set, the shadows move, the lessons endure. And somewhere in the quiet of night, when the last light fades and the first stars appear, you can almost feel the connection, that thread tying mind to matter, stone to sky, us to all who came before. Their names may be forgotten, but their language survives, written in the rhythm of the heavens and the patient memory of the earth. The echo lingers, soft, steady, and patient, pulling us toward the ancient patterns overhead, the ones that once guided every traveler, every builder, every dreamer who ever looked up and began to understand. Through those patterns, the story continues, carrying us into the next moment of wonder, where the language of the stars begins to speak again. When night settles in, far from cities and noise, the sky feels impossibly wide. There's a brief pause before your vision adjusts, and then suddenly the darkness fills with detail. Tiny points of light scatter in every direction, some steady, some trembling, some barely visible like memories fading at the edge of recall. It's easy to understand why our ancestors believed the sky spoke a language, not of words, but of rhythms, cycles, and constellations that repeated across ages. Long before writing, before carving tools or scrolls, the stars were the first text humans ever learned to read. For early people, the sky wasn't decoration, it was guidance. The stars gave direction, shaped migrations, measured time, and anchored every story they told. The night sky was humanity's first classroom, and each constellation was part of the lesson. What we now call myth was once method, a memory tool for survival, agriculture, and navigation. When people pointed to Orion, the Pleiades, or the Southern Cross, they weren't just naming shapes. They were recalling patterns, signaling seasons, predicting weather, and passing down histories long before they could be written. Across continents, the sky served as both map and mirror. The same cluster of stars might have different names in different languages, but the purpose was almost always the same: to teach, to preserve, to connect. In the northern hemisphere, the Pleiades signaled planting time for Greek farmers. For the Maori, it marked the new year. For Pacific navigators, it was an anchor point for ocean voyages. The same cluster seen by people an ocean apart carried the same message. This is the moment. Begin. The stars didn't speak in sentences. They spoke in timing. Those who listened survived. What's remarkable is how similar this sky literacy was among early cultures. No matter where you look, from Arabian nomads to Mesoamerican priest astronomers, the process was identical. Watch, record, predict, repeat. To study the heavens was to understand the rhythm of the earth itself, when rains would come, when rivers would rise, when herds would move. But eventually, curiosity shifted. The patterns stopped being just practical and became sacred. The stars became teachers. The oldest observatories on Earth weren't built from metal or glass. They were horizons, stone circles, and carefully placed markers, tracking where the sun rose or set at specific times of year. In the Sahara, the stone circle at Nabta Playa, more than 7,000 years old, still aligns with the midsummer sunrise. Its builders were simple herders, yet their precision shaped the civilizations that came later along the Nile. That accuracy didn't appear by accident. It came from generations of people paying patient, focused attention to the sky. You can imagine how it began. A family gathered around a fire, noticing a star rising earlier each night as the season shifted. Someone began keeping count. Over years, the pattern became prediction. When this star appears, the rains follow. Over generations, prediction became teaching. When you see this star, plant, and eventually it became story. When that star rises, the water god returns. By the time writing existed, the teaching was already a myth, but the truth inside it still held. Calling this a language isn't poetic, it's literal. The stars formed a system of meaning, and the night sky was the blackboard on which it was written. Each culture developed its own grammar. The Egyptians used Sirius to predict the Nile flood. The Babylonians tracked the wandering planets, laying the groundwork for early astronomy. Chinese imperial astronomers kept detailed records of comets and eclipses, both spiritual signs and scientific data. The Maya charted Venus with such accuracy that their calendar remained unmatched for centuries. Everywhere, studying the sky meant understanding the Earth's rhythm. And long before these systems were formalized, someone must have taught the very first way to look up. That's the quiet idea behind all of this. How did so many different cultures begin with almost the same approach? Aligning with solstices, counting lunar cycles, dividing the year by stars? Maybe they discovered it independently. But there's another possibility, a faint thread running through every culture. What if the way we read the sky was inherited from those who came earlier, the first teachers who treated the cosmos as a message system and passed that habit into us? When we look up today, the same movements unfold that guided those ancient learners. The Earth rotates, constellations drift, star patterns tilt and return. Every night repeats some earlier night. The ancients found comfort in that repetition. If the sky had order, maybe life did too. If you could predict the heavens, perhaps you could predict the world around you. That might be why early temples served as observatories. To align stone with the sky was to align human life with cosmic order. Even now, researchers find this celestial logic hidden in ancient sites. Teotihuacan's layout mirrors the 260-day sacred calendar of Mesoamerica. Angkor's temples align with the slow wobble of Earth's axis. The Callanish stones in Scotland track a rare lunar event that happens only every 18.6 years. These aren't accidents. They're calculations expressed through devotion, mathematics carved into architecture. The builders were writing in stone, using shadow and light as ink. What's fascinating is how the sky became both instruction and metaphor. Once humans recognized patterns above, they began seeing patterns everywhere: rivers, mountains, animal migrations. The universe became a model for structure itself. As above, so below, came thousands of years later, but the idea was already ancient. The order of the heavens became the pattern for the order of life. Early cities mirrored constellations, early laws reflected celestial cycles. Mythology echoed cosmic events, gods dying and rising like the sun, battles among the stars mirroring battles on Earth. There was no separation between astronomy and meaning. Science and spirituality were woven together. Ancient astronomers were also priests, storytellers, and engineers. They weren't simply describing the sky, they were interpreting it. The cosmos wasn't distant to them, it was intimate. Modern researchers suggest this fascination may even be biological. The human brain is wired for pattern recognition. It's how we survived. Finding order in the stars may have been the earliest form of science and the earliest form of comfort. The first person who realized the stars moved predictably must have felt awe, but also reassurance. The universe wasn't random. It could be understood that trust may have allowed early humans to shift from surviving to planning, and planning is the foundation of civilization. Every crop, every city, every temple began with someone looking up and tracing a pattern they knew would return. There's something gentle about that idea, that civilization began not with conquest, but with quiet observation. The sky asked for patience and humanity answered with dedication. Even today, with telescopes reaching deep into the universe, the process hasn't changed much. We still wait for light to arrive. We still turn it into meaning. The scale has changed, but the instinct hasn't. If an earlier civilization truly taught early humans anything, maybe their greatest gift was simple. Look up, pay attention, trust the rhythm of the heavens. That act became the first universal language, a language that needed no translation. The stars spoke the same way everywhere: Africa, Asia, the Americas. Everywhere the lessons were identical because the teacher was the same, the sky itself. Even now, ships, planes, and satellites use the same constellations for navigation. Our calendars still follow the sun. Our timekeeping follows the stars. We name our missions after the same lights our ancestors once worshipped. In a way, the conversation never stopped. The sky speaks, and in our modern way, we still respond. Imagine what that connection felt like at the beginning, standing alone in an open field with nothing but firelight and stars, hearing only the wind. The constellations weren't images then. They were companions. They rose when food returned, when journeys began, when children were born. Each star was a marker in a living calendar, and forgetting it meant forgetting how to live. Those who learned this language passed it down like a song, simple enough to survive the long silence between generations.